There was a Tuesday morning about 4 years ago when I stood in front of our open refrigerator with a plastic garbage bag in my hand. The house was quiet. Eleanor had gone out to the garden, and the morning light was just starting to hit the kitchen counters. I was throwing away food. I remember the exact weight of the packages hitting the bottom of the bag. The deli meats, the cured sausages, the sliced ham I had eaten for lunch almost every day of my working life, the bacon we kept for Sunday mornings. I was throwing it all out. My daughter Rebecca, who is a nutritionist, had been quietly warning me about processed meats for years. She never pushed, just gently suggested I read a few things. I finally did. And what I read about what those preservatives do to cellular tissue over decades made me walk straight to the kitchen and clear the shelves. But as I tied that garbage bag shut, I felt a sudden heavy sinking feeling in my chest. I realized that stopping the bad things was only half the equation. It felt like I was finally deciding to stop pouring water into a sinking boat, but I still had absolutely no idea how to repair the hole in the hull. The body warns you before it collects the debt. I have said that many times, and I believe it more with every passing year. My father was a proud, silent man who worked through his aches, ignored his fatigue, and treated his body like a machine that didn't need maintenance until the engine simply stopped working. He never wanted to know what was going on inside. I carry a lot of him in me, and for a long time I shared that exact same blindness. I assumed that as long as I didn't have a diagnosis, I was perfectly fine. But after Eleanor went through a deeply frightening health crisis a few years back, my entire perspective shattered. I realized that some damage happens quietly, until one day it doesn't anymore. I retreated into my study. I started waking up earlier, making my tea and sitting in my leather chair with medical journals, clinical trial notes, and research papers. I have spent my whole life in publishing, taking complicated text and trying to understand the core of it. So I applied that to human biology. I wanted to understand what was actually happening inside people my age. I found a set of records from autopsy studies that I had to put down and walk away from for a few hours. These were not studies of sick people. These were examinations of people who had passed away suddenly from accidents, people who had no history of chronic illness, no symptoms, no idea anything was wrong. When the pathologists looked closely with microscopes, they found microscopic clusters of abnormal, mutated cells in 40% of women in their 40s. They found them in 50% of men in their 50s. And then I read the line that stopped my breath. They found these silent microscopic clusters in 70% of people in their 70s. I am 77 years old. I didn't need a calculator to understand the math. The odds were absolute. These abnormal cells are not a possibility as we age. They are a certainty. They are forming right now. That realization terrified me at first. But as I kept reading with a pencil in my hand, tracing the lines of the research, the terror slowly turned into the most profound sense of agency I have ever felt. I learned that having these microscopic clusters is entirely normal. The reason most of them never turn into a devastating diagnosis is because of three specific quiet defense systems the body runs in the background. I had to understand these systems before I could figure out what to put back into my refrigerator. The first system is the quiet sweepers. That is how I think of them. Specialized immune cells that patrol the bloodstream 24 hours a day, checking every tissue, every organ, looking for cells that have forgotten how to behave. When they find a microscopic cluster of abnormal cells, they dismantle it. This happens thousands of times a decade, and we never feel a thing. The second system involves the background static of the body. When you cut your hand, the redness and swelling is a good thing. It is the body rushing to fix the break. But as we age, many of us develop a low-grade, constant hum of damage, a slow burn that never turns off. The research showed me that microscopic abnormal cells feed on this constant static. It signals them to grow faster, to ignore the body's natural stop signs. If you can lower that background static, the abnormal cells stay dormant. They simply sleep. The third system was the one that fascinated me the most. It felt like a revelation when I finally understood it. I learned about a physical limit. These tiny clusters of confused cells can only grow to the size of the tip of a ballpoint pen, about 2 millimeters. They hit a wall at that size because they do not have their own supply lines. They have no blood vessels to bring them oxygen. They are harmless specks. But if those cells manage to trick the body into building new blood vessels toward them, everything changes. Once the supply lines connect, that microscopic speck can multiply in size thousands of times over in a matter of weeks. The body actually has a built-in defense mechanism that denies these requests for new blood vessels. It keeps the supply lines cut off. If that defense is strong, the cluster stays microscopic forever. When I understood this, I stopped asking what I shouldn't eat, and I started hunting for what I could consume that would specifically strengthen those 3 precise defenses. I am telling you this because I wish someone had sat me down in a quiet room and explained this to me when I was 50 years old. It took me decades to piece this together, mostly because I was too stubborn to look earlier. If you feel that this is the kind of careful, honest conversation you want to be a part of, I would ask you to take a brief second and check if you are subscribed to the channel. Many folks who sit down with me for these videos every week aren't, and doing so helps me ensure this reaches the people who might be sitting in their own living rooms right now, needing to hear exactly this. The first thing I brought into my kitchen was green tea. I was a black coffee drinker for 50 years. I loved the ritual, the smell, the bitter edge of it. But I found a long-term study out of Japan that tracked over 8,000 people for an entire decade. The researchers were looking at a specific compound found in green tea leaves. It has a long chemical name, but the letters the researchers used were EGCG. I spent days reading about what this compound does. A university trial measured the background static in older adults, that low-grade damage hum I mentioned. After 8 weeks of drinking this tea, the major markers of that static dropped by up to 50%. Another study showed that it actually increased the activity of those quiet sweeper immune cells by nearly half. They simply became better at finding what shouldn't be there. But what convinced me to change my morning routine was reading how this compound affects the supply lines. In the laboratory notes, I read that when tissues are exposed to this specific tea compound, they actively resist building those new blood vessels. And because the tea travels all the way down the digestive tract, it essentially coats the esophagus, the stomach, and the intestines. The people in the Japanese study who drank it daily had dramatically lower rates of abnormal growths in their digestive systems. So I bought a box. But for the first 6 months, I was ruining the very thing I was trying to consume. I was boiling the kettle, pouring scalding hot water directly over the tea bag, and drinking it. I didn't know that boiling water actually damages the specific compound I was trying to extract. Furthermore, drinking liquids at that scalding temperature actually injures the delicate tissue of the throat over time. Now, I let the kettle boil, and then I forced myself to wait. I watched the clock on the stove for exactly 3 minutes. It lets the temperature drop just enough. Then I pour it over the leaves and let it steep for 5 full minutes. I drink 2 or 3 cups a day now. Eleanor often watches me time it, shaking her head, but she knows better than to interrupt my counting. The second edition made my son Daniel raise his eyebrows when he came over for dinner. I started buying broccoli, but I entirely changed how I handled it. For my whole life, I would eat the little green trees at the top and throw the thick woody stalk directly into the compost bin. Then I read the biochemical breakdown of the plant. Cruciferous vegetables contain a sulfur-based molecule that the body uses in extraordinary ways. When I read the clinical explanations, it sounded almost like science fiction. This compound goes into the cells and flips a genetic switch. It literally tells the body to manufacture its own internal repair mechanisms, rather than relying on vitamins from the outside. It also actively prevents those rogue supply lines from forming. But the tragedy of my compost bin was that the stalk, the part I had been throwing away for 70 years, contains twice as much of this critical compound as the top part we all prefer to eat. I was discarding the medicine. I had to figure out how to make it edible. Now I take that thick stalk and slice it on a sharp diagonal. It exposes more of the surface. I warm a little olive oil, put the slices in with some minced garlic, and let them soften. But I didn't stop there. I found research from a major university hospital testing 3-day-old broccoli sprouts. These tiny, fragile white stems with little green leaves. The researchers found that because the plant is just beginning its life, those tiny sprouts contain nearly 100 times more of the protective compound than the fully grown plant. The participants in the trial ate just half a cup of these sprouts a day, and after 3 months, the biomarkers for cellular damage in their blood had plummeted. I don't buy them at the store anymore. I bought a glass mason jar and a bag of seeds. I soak 2 tablespoons of seeds overnight, rinse them twice a day, and leave the jar on the kitchen counter. In 3 days, I have a jar full of them. I put a handful on whatever I am eating for lunch. It costs pennies, and I know exactly what it is doing inside me. The third food required me to look past my geography. Growing up in Ohio and now living in Tennessee, tropical fruit was not something my father ever brought home. Papaya was something I only saw in pictures or on the rare vacation. But I came across an 18-year observational study tracking over 70,000 women. They were tracking a specific orange pigment, a compound that the body absorbs and distributes. What caught my attention, and what made me put my pencil down and stare at the wall, was where this compound chooses to go. It preferentially accumulates in the delicate tissue of the lungs. In my 20s, I smoked, not heavily, but enough. It was a different time, and we didn't ask questions. Even though I stopped decades ago, I have always carried a quiet anxiety about what legacy I left inside my chest. The study showed that people who consumed the highest amounts of this specific compound from papaya had significantly lower rates of cellular abnormalities in their lungs. And this held true even for the people who had a history of smoking. It acts as a localized defense in that specific tissue. So I started looking for it at the local market. You cut it open, scoop out the black seeds, and the flesh is incredibly sweet. But that sweetness brought up a fear I had to unlearn. For a long time, I believed that all sugar was dangerous for cellular growth. I had heard people say that abnormal cells feed on sugar. It is a terrifying oversimplification. Yes, those cells use energy, but so does my brain, and so does my heart. The danger I discovered wasn't in the sugar itself, but in the massive spikes of insulin caused by processed, empty carbohydrates. When I eat a bowl of fresh papaya, the natural sugars are bound up in dense cellular fiber. It digests slowly. There is no massive spike. I learned to separate the fear of a manufactured syrup from the profound protective mechanism of a whole fruit. I buy it frozen when I can't find it fresh, and I eat a cup of the chunks mid-morning. The fourth food I added changed the way I look at the produce aisle entirely. I had never seen a purple potato until a few years ago. They look dusty and dark on the outside, but when you cut into them, the flesh is a vibrant, deep violet. That color is not just decoration. It is the visible evidence of a specific family of antioxidants. I found a research paper from a laboratory testing the exact extracts from these purple potatoes. They were looking at something called stem cells. When I read the explanation of what a stem cell is in this context, it made my blood run cold. I read an analogy comparing it to the roots of a weed in a garden. You can pull the weed, you can clear the dirt, you can make the surface look pristine, but if you leave the deep taproot in the soil, it will eventually push its way back through the earth. Some abnormal cell clusters have these foundational root cells. The laboratory studies showed that the specific dark compounds in the purple potato actively sought out and neutralized those root cells in the digestive tract, while leaving the healthy tissue completely alone. It is a selective defense. I started buying them immediately. But just like the tea, I had to learn the right way to treat them. Eleanor thought I was losing my mind the first time I did this. I baked a tray of diced purple potatoes, pulled them out of the oven smelling wonderful, and instead of serving them, I put a lid on the glass container and placed them straight into the refrigerator overnight. I had read about the molecular structure of starches. When you cook a potato and then let it cool completely, the physical shape of the starch changes. It becomes resistant. When you eat it the next day, it doesn't break down into rapid sugar. Instead, it travels intact down to the lower intestine, where it becomes the perfect food for the beneficial bacteria that live there. Those bacteria eat the cooled starch and release compounds that lower the background static in the entire body. So I eat them the next day, either cold with a little oil or just gently warmed up. It is a cascade of protection from one simple root vegetable. The final addition to my routine happens in the evening, when the house is quiet again. I started keeping a bottle of pure pomegranate juice in the refrigerator. I am very careful to check the label to ensure it isn't a blend filled with apple juice and added sweeteners, just the pure, tart, dark red press of the fruit. I found a clinical trial from a university in California that studied men exactly my age, dealing with the exact fears men my age deal with. They had a history of prostate issues, and their numbers were starting to climb again. A climbing number is a terrifying thing to watch on a piece of paper. The researchers had these men drink a small glass of this juice every day. What the researchers observed was astonishing. The compounds in the pomegranate, these large, complex molecules, travel down into the gut, but the body can't actually use them on its own. We rely on a very specific strain of bacteria in our digestive tract to break those molecules down into a new substance. That new substance then enters the bloodstream and tells the body to shut down the supply lines to those microscopic abnormal cells. For the men in the study, the time it took for their concerning numbers to double stretched out dramatically. The growth slowed to a crawl. Some of them stabilized completely. Furthermore, the compounds in the juice actually encourage that specific, highly beneficial bacteria to multiply. It is a beautiful symbiotic loop. Every night, about an hour before I turn off the lights in my study, I pour 4 ounces of the juice into a glass and mix it with 4 ounces of water to soften the tartness. I drink it slowly. I know that while I sleep, that quiet messenger in the gut is doing exactly what it was designed to do. I want to be very clear about how I view all of this because I refuse to sit here and offer false promises. I have lived long enough to know that there are no absolute guarantees. If a doctor tells you that you need a medical intervention, you listen to that doctor. You do what is required. What I am talking about is not a replacement for the profound advancements of modern medicine. But I also know that leaving our daily choices entirely up to chance is a tragic mistake. Most people realize too late what had been warning them for years. You cannot control everything. We all carry the microscopic echoes of aging inside us right now. But you can control the environment those echoes live in. Every time I wait 3 minutes for my tea water to cool, every time I slice a broccoli stalk instead of throwing it away, every time I eat a cold purple potato or drink that tart juice in the evening, I am actively changing the environment inside my own body. I am not doing this because I am afraid of aging. I am doing this because I want to be the one who walks my grandson to the park. I want to be the one sitting across from Eleanor at the breakfast table for as many years as this world will allow. I want to remain a participant in my own life. You don't need fear, you need attention. Envelhecer well starts with what you stop ignoring, but it is secured by what you deliberately choose to build. I hope you will look at your own refrigerator tomorrow morning and ask yourself what kind of environment you are building. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take good care of yourself, and I will see you soon.